Hello ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome to this week's video. This time around I will be creating a maquette, a small-scale design sculpture meant to explore an idea and perhaps to be used in the future for a larger scale project. My model is a busy man, and so we only work a few times a week at most. The days he's not in the studio, I need something to do. And making small maquettes has allowed me to, again, connect with my former, younger, unsullied self. These types of sculptures was all I really used to do when my studio was in my bedroom, in my apartment in Oslo, and I worked late at night after classes and work. The sculptures were of course small by necessity, because my bedroom was small, and it's a great feeling to get back to this kind of sculpting. Today we will be making this sculpture. As you can see, I've started off with the armature. It's really simple, just some aluminum armature wire wrapped together and suspended on a makeshift cross-like structure. Always remember to wrap your armature wire in a thinner wire to help the clay hang on. It's a crucial step. I've used hose clamps to attach the armature to the cross. I kind of guessed at the proportions here, so I'm not so worried about it. This is just a maquette, and so all I really care about is that the upper body and the legs are pretty much the same length, more or less. As you can probably see, there is no head armature, and the head at this scale doesn't really need an armature. Later on in the video, you'll see me just stick a small piece of wire into the clay, and that will be enough support for the head. This clay is pretty hard, so it'll hold its own weight pretty well actually. The clay I will be using is Chavant NSP Medium, brought with me from Norway. Now, if you're in the US, Chavant NSP Medium is pretty easy to get a hold of. And if you're in Europe, you should check out terranti.co.uk, which is also the website I get all my tools from, and where I get my aluminum armature wire, which can also be pretty hard to come by. Chavant NSP Medium is a pretty firm clay, so I make sure to heat it up before starting to sculpt, to make the progress and the process a little bit faster, and to keep my fingers from bleeding at the end of the day. I chop the clay up into small pieces, and this just speeds up the heating process. And I use a ceramic heater that I normally use for the model to make sure they don't freeze when they're standing there naked. And I put the clay on some aluminum foil just to make sure the clay doesn't get contaminated by water-based clay dust, and that if the clay potentially melts, it's not gonna create a big giant mess. If you don't have a ceramic heater, which you probably don't, you can always use a toaster oven, a microwave, or just a hot lamp. Just make sure you're careful, because you can burn yourself really badly if the clay gets warm. So while we fly past the blocking in stage, I'll explain why we're getting started at such a furious pace in just a few moments. I'd like to direct your attention to my Patreon page and my new web store. A web store is quite exciting. It's the first time I've ever had one of those. And there are links to both in the description below. If you are looking to become a better sculptor, you can learn from me personally, or if you just enjoy the content that I make and you would like to support me and the channel and help it improve, the Patreon page is the place for you. You'll also get 25% off everything in the web store if you're a Patreon supporter. This sculpture that we're making right here is in the web store. And there will only be 25 resin copies made of this sculpture. There'll be a couple of bronze copies too, but they won't be in the web store. So only 25 resin copies, so if you're interested, you should act really fast. There's a link in the description below, and as always, all support is greatly appreciated. As I said, I'll be flying past the blocking in stage, so if you're deeply interested in block-ins and would like to learn how I block something in, you could obviously rewatch this part a couple of times just to catch what's going on, or you can look to the video in the top right corner where I properly explain how I begin a block-in of a figure. The reason for flying past the blocking stage on this video is that because it's a small maquette, there's really no rhyme or reasoning behind the way I block things in. The maquette is very small and the work is very flexible, and so I just kind of wing it, honestly. When I work in larger scales, I have to think and focus a ton, and mistakes are very costly and hard to fix. But in this small scale, mistakes are easy to fix, and this is a very, very refreshing change of pace. But because of this, I don't think there's really that much to learn. From watching this part of the video. So just know I have other videos on blockings that you can watch. This sculpture is kind of a continuation on the theme my current large-scale sculpture, PT, there's a link in the top right corner to the videos on PT right now. But at the same time, I haven't given that much thought to what this sculpture really means or anything like that. For now, I find that this sculpture is really about the visual image that this sculpture creates. It's just an interesting visual, something that I thought would look really, really cool. I've often thought it would be amazing to sculpt a sculpture of Jesus on the cross, kind of like Léon Bonnat painted. Now, if this painting of Jesus isn't the most metal thing you've ever seen, I don't know. This is exactly how I would like to sculpt. But I'm not very religious or anything like that, so it doesn't really feel like an appropriate thing to do on my own, unless someone were to pay me to do it. So, if you're part of a church by any chance, and think a sculpture similar to this would be an amazing thing to have in your church, let me know, and let's make it happen. Now, luckily for me, I had just kind of stumbled into a project with a lot of pretty religious themes. PT at its core is about aiming your life upwards and asking what must be done, which is essentially what prayer is really about, psychologically. It's about asking, and by asking, revealing to yourself the true nature of your questions and what must be done to answer them. So I was already kind of in the realm of religion, even though PT draws its inspiration from 1920s cosmic horror, and the prayer that PT is performing is to a cosmic entity. I, however, thought that the connection was there enough for me to pivot into attaching my PT posed figure on a PT-shaped cross. And I know it's a little out there. I've always loved weird science fiction and fiction in general, and so I find that I often end up drawing my inspiration from these sources. And I think it's a really interesting idea to get inspired by pop culture and use it to create art. And in a way it becomes art that belongs to a different world or a different universe. I do have a plan, we'll see how this goes, but I do have a plan to, at some point, take on a sculpture of one of the damned characters from Dante's Divine Comedy. Now for me, I think this is the ultimate work of fiction. But Dante's story is already very, very ingrained in our culture in so many ways. It's considered one of the greatest literary achievements in human history. And so it stands to reason that it has inspired many artists throughout the centuries. Now other, way more obscure works of fiction that will in all likelihood be lost to time are to me equally intriguing. While they don't carry the same weight and recognizability, and for good reason, as the Divine Comedy, using these sources as inspiration allows me to leave what has had an impact on me behind in a better state than when I found it, at least hopefully. Potentially in a worse state, but who knows? That's up to other people than me to decide. I find these things to be catalysts for visually interesting sculptures. And if nothing else, they keep me immensely interested in whatever sculpture I'm working on, which is obviously important. It's very tough to finish a sculpture you're not interested in, so I think it's an important thing. Once the block-in is more or less there, I start to fill in the gaps and refine the forms. I'm not looking to make this sculpture very tight. Tight being a term for finishing or high level of detail. This sculpture will be fairly loose, which is the opposite of tight, obviously. More of an impression than anything else. Which is really all a maquette needs to be, I think. It's not about detail or anatomy. It's about conveying a story, an overall visual impression, one that will hopefully translate across to the larger scale piece, which will have all the anatomical details and a beautiful portrait, fingernails, toenails, belly buttons, nipples, veins, etc. So in many ways, a piece like this is more about what is not there, more about what the eye of the beholder will fill in with their imagination. Which is a very exciting idea, because the beholder's imagination is usually better than what any of us can ever do, in many cases at least. And probably in my case. My larger scale works gets pretty detailed and tight, so I take this opportunity to make something quick and loose. A sculpture like this takes me about 5 to 6 hours to make. My current large-scale work, PT, has taken me 3 months already, and it will probably take me another 3 months to finish. So this is a breath of fresh air, and an opportunity to sculpt something different than what I've been used to. I'll use a variety of tools and techniques to clean up my blocking. I mix up the tools, and I go between using tools, using my fingers, and using a torch, which I'll talk more about later, but it's a neat addition to my family of tools. For the most part, you'll see me use a wooden tool and small pieces of clay to fill in between the gaps of my blocking. Sometimes I'll add or refine certain areas if the blocking is not to my satisfaction, which can only really become apparent once the gaps have been partially filled. I'll also use my Kemper loop tool quite a bit. This is my current oldest tool from, I think, back in 2010 or 2011. Now, Kemper is a classic, and they have the best loop tools on the market, in my opinion. Now, obviously, you can use whatever tool you feel comfortable using. I used to exclusively use metal tools, usually metal dental tools, but when I came to Florence, Rob recommended strongly that I transition into using wood tools. I did, and I have never looked back. I love the way they feel when you work with them. But it's really about what you're used to at the end of the day. Most important thing I think to remember is that there is no magic trick, no shortcut, no tool that can solve your sculpting issues. Only your eyes and thinking mind can do that. A few thoughts on the pose. I tried my best to convey a tortured figure. Often you'll find Jesus depicted on the cross looking quite peaceful, but I wanted something a little more raw and a little bit more gruesome. A little closer to the reality of what it must have been like hanging on a cross. By imagining him hanging with most of his weight supported by the raised arm alone, I could kind of balance the figure in a way. Now, normally we'll balance the standing figure by lining up the ankle with the pit of the neck, in general. This is not always the case, but in general. And I have a whole video on this subject, there's a link in the top right corner. But in this case, he's hanging from one arm mostly. So I try to imagine what would happen to the body when you hang from one arm. And when you do hang from one arm, most of your mass will be underneath the point holding you up, holding the figure up. To sell that idea, I swung the body underneath his raised right arm, I tilted his ribcage to the left, and I tilted his pelvis to the right, creating a kind of hanging contrapposto in a way. To get some gesture out of the side view, I decided not to have him stretched out on the cross, but attached his feet slightly higher up, forcing the figure to hang out from the cross, creating a very nice C-curve. In many ways, I think the figure appears on the brink of death, almost limp, hanging from the cross, with most of his weight supported by the nail through his right wrist. His head, which he is unable to support the weight of anymore, hangs limp off his shoulders. Hands, like the portrait, are quite loose, and only need to resemble a hand, really, to sell the idea. The sculpture is small enough to where I don't think there is any need for fingers, or at least not to convey what this particular sculpture is all about. I cut the heads of 4 small nails to create shorter nails, essentially, that he's attached to the cross with. On the arms, I decided to attach the nails through his wrists. Now, the reason I did this is because if I were to make a larger scale piece, a larger scale version of this piece, I would prefer the nails through his wrists, because it gives me the opportunity to have more gesture and movement in the hands. Having his left hand hanging limp, turned over, creating that great twisting movement in the arm, while his right hand reaches for the heavens. If the nails went through the hand, it would lock them to the cross and would take away all possibility to play with the gesture. I'm very unlikely to do a large-scale version of this sculpture, by the way, at least for a long while, I think. No model can hold a pose like this, so it would be a very tricky sculpture to make. But I would love to try one day, and I hope to make it happen one day in the future. To finish the sculpture off and give it a nicer surface, I use a buffalo alcohol torch, fueled with denatured alcohol or any other clean burning fuel that won't leave your sculpture covered in soot. I run it gently over the surface to soften it down just a touch. When you do this, you want to make sure that you don't stay in the same area for too long. I find that it gives a very nice effect, and together with the next step, it'll make the sculpture really pop. Once the clay hardens up again, which happens fairly quickly, it's time for the last step, which is brushing the sculpture with talcum powder or baby powder. Now you can compare this to using water and a brush on water-based clay, but it's way more subtle, a lot less aggressive than water on water-based clay. To clean off the talcum powder, I spray the sculpture with water and brush it again. This also helps give the sculpture a bit of a satin finish, which I really like. And that's it. Here is the finished sculpture. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, check out my Patreon page and consider giving a donation to help me pay for models and materials. You'll also get 25% off in my web store if you're a Patreon subscriber, where you can buy this very sculpture. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Please share the video, it really helps me grow. Thank you for watching, keep creating, and I hope to see you in the next one.